this is where, you go and do your homework, you talk about, right, what is fair and what is equitable. Please do not do anything for free. Okay, please, please, please. I know everyone's like, it's a great opportunity. This is a great way to get your experience and all that stuff. Please don't do anything for free because what you will get out of it, right, is definitely not only, getting exposure to all of the stuff, but you're going to be doing all this extra work. So please, get compensation for that. And then the last thing I'll say in terms of recommendations is just make sure that you take time to identify what are the things you want out of this interim experience. It should align. I know it's so hard because it's so awesome to feel wanted. People want you,
Mhm.
to step up and do this role.
Hello, and welcome to Student Affairs Now. I'm your host, Keith Edwards. Interim leadership can be complex for the individual and the institution. Today's guests have all experience as interim leaders in very different personal, professional, and institutional contexts. Today, we'll get to hear what they have learned to help both leaders and institutions navigate these roles as effectively as possible. So grateful for all three of you for being here and can't wait for the conversation. Student Affairs Now is the premier podcast and online learning community for thousands of us who work in, alongside, or adjacent to the field of higher education and student affairs. We release new episodes every week on Wednesdays. You can find details about this episode or browse the archives at studentaffairsnow.com. This episode is sponsored by Evolve. Evolve is a series of leadership coaching journeys designed to bring clarity, capacity, confidence, and compassion, empowering courageous leadership to reimagine the future of higher education with my colleagues Brian Arau and Don Lee, who is with us today. As I mentioned, I'm your host, Keith Edwards. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a speaker, author, and coach empowering higher ed leadership for better tomorrows for us all through leadership, learning, and equity. You can find out more about me at keithedwards.com. And I'm recording this from my home in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which is at the current and ancestral homelands of both the Dakota and the Ojibwe peoples. Let's get our guests in here. I'd love for you each to introduce yourselves a little bit, and especially your experience with interim roles. So, Dr. Letitia Williams, get us started.
Sure. Thank you so much for the invitation, Keith, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. I'm Dr. Letitia Williams. I am the interim Vice President for Student Affairs and Dean of Students at Morgan State University. My career I've been in higher ed now, I won't say how long, because I will not date myself, but multiple institution types, different countries, that has shaped my approach to the work of student affairs as well as to leadership and leadership development. Um, I will say that this is my first interim role. I have not served as an interim before, and I've been serving in the role for about 9 months now. And the complexities of being a leader in student affairs at this level, I think a little bit multiplied because I'm kind of sitting in two roles as an interim leader, but that's kind of where I come into this conversation about interim leadership.
Beautiful. Thank you. And Dr. Ed Gabellin, tell us a little bit more about you and some interim roles.
Yes, thanks, Keith. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be with everyone today. I'm Dr. Ed Cabellin. I use he, him pronouns, and I proudly serve Frederick Community College as its interim vice president for student experience. This is my second interim gig where I've come in from the outside to serve as an interim, first at Montgomery College last year, and now at Frederick Community College in Maryland. I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
Awesome. Thank you. And Dr. Don Lee and I get to spend lots of time through our Evolve, so it's good to see you and have a different conversation today. Tell us more about you, Don.
Yeah, thank you again, Keith, for the invitation. And so good to be in community with both Dr. Williams, Dr. Cabion. Very good. So, hello, everybody. My name is Dawn Lee, she, they pronouns. I am a consultant and a coach. Um, a lot of my clients hire me to help them figure out how to manage and create plans around hard change. So, hard change institutions in higher education and in nonprofits, and hard change, anything to do with organizational restructure, budget reductions, all of the really difficult, sticky things. So I do a lot of consulting work, which connects to the executive coaching work that I do, which then also connects to the fractional or interim roles that I have had an opportunity to have in the past. I'm currently not in interim role. I've had three interim roles before, and am a fractional leader, and really excited to share more about those experiences in our conversation.
Yeah, awesome. Well, let's open up here now that we've done introductions, get you all here on the screen. I'd like each of you to give each of you an opportunity, what you've learned from your own unique journeys. Ed's in this multiple external role, Letitia is in this internal role, Dawn is in multiple roles. Dawn, I want to start with you. You use this term interim and fractional. Are those interchangeable? Are those slightly different? Maybe you just kind of clear that up for folks who maybe aren't as familiar. And then what have you learned from your own unique interim journey?
Yeah, I use those words interchangeably, but I feel like fractional really encompasses not only what happens in higher education, but also education as adjacent organizations. But fractional, the term really comes from industry. And so within higher education, we use the word interim, but they're one and the same. The difference too between fractional and interim is that, and we have our differences here. We have internal interims, and then we have external, right, interims. So Ed and Letitia are we'll probably talk a little bit about that. Um, the second part of your question,
Mhm.
which is about, what have I learned or what's unique, to my interim journey. And this is connected to the question that people ask me all the time. They're so curious.
Mhm.
How did you get, your interim role? Where did that come from? And you've been interim so many times, like, how does that happen? Is there like a place I can go to do this, right? So a lot of the interim roles that I've had, and this connects to my learning, right, have actually come from consulting work, that I've done before, project work that I've done, and then the executive coaching work that I do as well. And it's a great entry point for folks who are curious, right? If I'm working on an interim, if I'm working on a project, then what ends up happening is that I become essentially a very niche expert in that specific thing.
Mm.
And I really take time to get to know not only the immediate partners, campus partners in that work, but I take advantage of all of the other stakeholders who may have some touch points with the work. And it's a really wonderful process because not only am I doing this highly impactful work through my consulting work, right? But I'm broadening and I'm helping other stakeholders understand why it's important that we're doing, this specific thing on this campus.
Mhm.
And that's resulted in a lot of, conversations about potential interim, roles. And then in the senior leadership coaching, right? Working with senior leaders, helping them figure out how to make really, really tough decisions. Um, I should say that has led to interim opportunities, but I have a very unique approach to doing interim opportunities. I don't take any kind of interim opportunity, right? And you know what? I'm gonna leave that as a little cliffhanger for
Mhm.
some of the stuff that we're gonna talk about later. But that's what I'll share for now.
Yeah, thank you, Don. Thank you, Don. Letitia, what have you learned through your unique interim journey that you're
Mm.
still in?
That right. So full disclosure that I'm still in. Um, so when I came to in my current institution, I was the number two.
Mhm.
Um, and then when the vice president was retiring, I was asked to serve in the interim role. Um, I had, like I said before, never served in an interim role. So one of the things that I learned for me that I've said repeatedly is that for me, it's been an interesting headspace. Um, because I'm internal, I feel I'm betwixt and between. Um, I'm not the VP. I That position there's actually a search for the position. And so I'm in the role. Am I aspiring to the next or the permanent role? It's a kind of in between headspace. And so for me, what I've learned is kind of really, I'm also a coach, so I did a lot of self-coaching in this for myself in terms of kind of really clarifying who I am, how my identity is connected to the role, kind of what are my aspirations, what are my options. I think that's really, really clear. When I accepted the role, and I think what I've learned is also getting clarity about what is the expectation during the interim period. I'm not going to kind of just run off and do all sorts of things, which can also be, I think, a temptation. So what is the expectation? But also I kind of grounded myself in terms of, apart from, yes, these are the expectations in my case of the president, what is needed for the division to continue to move forward? Um, and I kind of anchored that to the strategic priorities of the institution. So we're not kind of just, doing anything we want to do. I think the last thing for me is that leadership is connected all through the institution. And I had to also be mindful that some of that interim headspace that I was experiencing, my team was experiencing, right? Because so many things come at us in student affairs. Folks are really, really busy. And so now, if you give them something else to do, it's kind of like, well, is this going to last because you're interim? So is this work interim? And so kind of really being transparent with the team about kind of even my headspace, but also kind of the work that we're doing, and making sure that we kept building things that were really going to be impactful in the long term for students and the institution, and managing, things that might have been peripheral. But I think those are some things.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I think that clarity is interesting because I think some people are expected to be interim and kind of keep an even keel and not shake things up until there's a permanent leader. And some are explicitly told, I need you to shake things up, do the hard stuff. So when the new leader comes in, they don't have to make all these unpopular decisions, right? So it can be a really different role and probably everything in between there. Ed, what do you want to add here?
Sure. I think my journey is a little different, and I'll start with the fact that I think I will age myself here. I've almost 30 years now and have served in student affairs roles throughout that period of time. And in my second vice presidency at Curry College in Massachusetts, small private liberal arts college, I was the VP of enrollment. And after 4 years of being there, the president retired and a new president came in and shook things up. And I was part of that. I was unfortunately part of the shakeup that happened there. And so I found myself for the first time in my career really trying to figure out what I wanted to do next. And I think one of the lessons I learned in this is that you build your network throughout your career for times when you need to activate it. Help. And I had put myself out there on LinkedIn saying that I was in between, that I was looking, that this had happened, um, against advice of some of my colleagues who said, no, don't put yourself out there, just do the thing and reach out. And I said, you know what, I'm just going to put myself out there. It'll be okay. And because of that, Dr. Jermaine Williams, who's the president of Montgomery College in Maryland, reached out and said, I saw that you were in between. Would you be interested in serving as an interim? Our senior vice president for student affairs just took a presidency and is leaving and would love to see. And we had known each other because we were VPs in the community college system in Massachusetts. He was a VPSA, I was a VP. So we had been in affinity groups together. So we knew each other. We knew each other's work. And at the time when I took that interim gig in the summer of 24, my family, my house, everything is here. Like it's in Massachusetts. And I had to think about to myself, I want to do where I want to be traveling back and forth for an interim gig. And for me, the learning opportunity was because this was an opportunity that was in a different state, a different community college system, and a chance for me to broaden my horizons. My family and I thought it was the right decision. And I know colleagues who are doing that. There are more and more colleagues that I know who are doing these types of interim gigs or fractional, as Dawn had said, because they're great opportunities. It really challenges what your knowledge and thinking are in a different environment. So, and after my Montgomery College interim last year, moving to Frederick this year, I asked for a 2-year contract. And I asked for a 2-year contract because of what I learned in the first year of doing a 1-year interim, knowing, to Letitia's point, that it's hard to figure out what you can do, even though you do get a scope of work. You find things in the interim, especially coming in from the outside where you have fresh eyes, and you just start naturally asking questions and you start naturally saying, well, why? And how did we get here? And what if we tried this? And what if we tried that? And so I think that the biggest lesson I've taken away is that interim roles can be accelerators to change because of the posted finite nature of the role, that you have a shelf life. And within that shelf life, you've been asked to do the scope of work and you're going to get it done because that's what's been asked of you. And that urgency is an advantage in pushing along change that may not happen with a permanent person who wants to take their time and slow down. And I'll end by saying that I think if you're serving in a VP role, everyone's interim right now. I think the academy right now is I, just calling it interim. I know many of my colleagues who feel like it at any moment, because we've seen it with our colleagues across the country.
So true.
We really all are serving in interim. I mean, these are contracts that are at will for the most part.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Um, but I've definitely learned a lot and grown from the interim experience, and I'll share more about that as we move forward.
Yeah. Wonderful. That's such a great start and gives us perspective that each of you are bringing. I want to say that these next two questions are paired. And so I just want to share with our audience. So first, I'm going to ask, what about leaders who are thinking about, considering, or sometimes told they're taking an interim role should think about? And then second, what should institutions think about who maybe are considering an interim role for a period of time? So we'll talk about sort of the person and then the organization next. But I do want to begin with if there are people in our audience who are watching or listening to this who think an interim might come up at their institution or another institution, or they've been invited, or they're considering it. Um, or as Don and I were recently at the NASPA AVP, people were like, "You got asked? I was told I'm moving into this interim role. You could say no. Like that thought never even occurred to me." So yes, considering invited, told, what would you want people to think through as they consider that? We'll begin with you, Letitia.
I, I think the context that you're in. I think you really have to know your institutional context because a lot of how the interim role shapes out, I think, is also based on the culture of the institution. So I think you really have to think about that. I think you gotta make sure, can you ask and do you think you would get clear expectations? And I'm talking about it from the perspective of an internal interim. Um, because those expect without them, and I think Ed might be able to say this, but I just feel, not having done what Ed has done, that in an external interim role, there are challenges, but there are different challenges. So internally, I'm like managing what was, where we were. Externally, I'm like, I don't know. So, I think you got to make sure that expectations are as clear as they can be. I also think for practitioners, because sometimes I think, especially in student affairs, we are so close to the work that we often don't talk about some of the economics of the work. And so even just is there going to be an increment? Are there going to be resources? And have like really clarifying the questions. Is someone below me going to also be made interim so that they can kind of help and take some of the lifting? I think those are really some of the things. And then I think you got to think about, what's going to happen if they post this? Are they going to invite you to apply for the role? Are they going to leave you in the role? Try and get clarity on some of that so that, kind of professionally in terms of your own trajectory, you have as much kind of, scope as you can, even though the role is interim.
Yeah. I appreciate it because I think I've heard from folks who are in similar roles to you that, um, yeah, if you want the permanent role, you better take the interim because it's your best way to kind of prove yourself. And in other structures, if you take the interim role, you cannot apply for the permanent role. It's the conflict, right? And so just being clear about some of those things
Yeah.
as you navigate through that this is there are places in higher ed where things are similar across contexts. This seems to be like every context is just up for grabs and it could be completely different from one to one, as I see all three of you nodding your
Mhm.
heads at that. Okay, good to know. Ed, what would you want folks who are considering interim roles to be thinking through?
So I would offer, if you're on the outside looking at taking a role, obviously my situation was as a result of structural change at my previous institution, but I do think there's value in folks who are looking to move, who are ready to go to a different type of institution or a different part of the country or whatever. And if the market is right now not, in their favor, to think about putting themselves out there, being open for interim roles, to
Mm.
say to search firms, to say to colleagues that, look, I'm searching. I'm also open to searching for interim roles. I think saying that as part of your process is going to be important. The why behind it, you've got to be super clear because if there are and if there are open interim roles, you typically find out about it through networking. It's not going to be something that's posted. I have not seen too, unless they're through the registry. So unless they're through a firm, I don't see a lot of interim roles. And I apparently was I did not have the proper experience to be part of the registry at the time of when I was in between. So, I would say to really think about just speaking that truth, that you would be open to that idea so that because the reality is if you are coming in from the outside, there's less of a search process, for a formal search process. It's really light. I would say like I got to meet with the staff I was supervising with cabinet on Zoom just to get a sense for how we'd work together. If the president is making that call, eventually she, they are going to make sure that the person is going to fit at least for the time being, right?
Mhm.
Ed, could
The
you
other
just
thing,
say a little bit about the registry? Because I think this is one of those things that I learned about halfway through my career and I had no idea. Could you just
oh,
explain
sure.
that?
Yeah, yeah. So quickly, the registry is it's a firm that matches interim roles with professionals who more often than not have retired, who have completed their full-time career in an executive position, but who are open to short-term assignments, whether it's a year, 18 months, 6 months. It could be fractional work. And when you sign up to be part of the registry, you interview, you are vetted, and if you become part of the registry, the agreement is that you will not be allowed to apply for the permanent role. That if you are placed by the registry in an interim role, you've acknowledged you're doing this for the term that's been established and that you're not going to apply for the full-time role. What I've liked about both of these processes is that it was clear from the beginning whether I was able to apply
Yeah.
and what the process would be. And I had clarity on both. For both Montgomery and now Frederick, I am aware of what that is going to look like moving forward. And so I think knowing that, and I would just say, in terms of just the last thing I'll say about advice for folks thinking about this is that it's so important to know what that scope of work they're looking for. Like it has to be clear that there are three things we need you to do in this 1 year interim: A, B, and C. And that's it. And that clarity is baked into the contract. It's baked into however you talk about it with other people. Like it has to be aligned because otherwise other things could creep in that you didn't know about or sign up for it. Are there personnel things you're going to have to deal with? Are there larger community stuff that you're walking into? Knowing why the job is open as an interim is part of that due diligence that I would advise folks to do before they went into either, that agreement of, okay, I'll think about it, or I want to go to the opportunity.
Yeah.
Mm.
Awesome. Don, what would you add?
Wow, so much good stuff here. And for listeners, I would definitely replay this last section that you just heard because Letitia and Ed like just said so much stuff. I had to cross stuff off my list that I wanted to mention. Um, so I realized I forgot to actually talk about how I came into interim work, right? Because that actually connects to some of the recommendations. So my first job, my first interim role was actually as an internal. I was over at UC Berkeley and I was the interim associate dean of students there. And I need to give a real huge shout out to, at the time, Joseph Dufresne, who was the dean of students, who's now over at Columbia, and then also David Surratt, who's at University of Oklahoma, and that the belief in both of them to be able to do this role really enabled me to cut my teeth in doing interim work. So that's probably one of the first things I would say is, even get to know people within your own organization who, if you're curious about this, right, express that. I think somebody said earlier, say it, just say the things that you're interested in, right? Especially with people who can look out for those opportunities for you. And it's really, Joseph and David who gave me that first opportunity. And it was such a unique role at that time, right? And to what Letitia was talking about, I had to juggle both roles.
Mm.
So being very clear, and I didn't do a good job of this the first time, not because of, Joseph or David. It was just because I didn't know any better, right? Asking those questions. What's my, what are the things that I'm focusing on? What are some of the priorities in this role? I wasn't clear on that, and learning from that, absolutely underscored, what has been said before. The other thing, right, that I didn't do, right, is that I went in assuming that I had to just embody the role like wholesale, just right from the beginning. I had to do everything. I had to learn all the things, right? Just in connection to the first one, right? But what that created and what a lot of people talk to me about, right, about interim roles is that you're like a warm body that's you're just kind of holding space. You're
Mhm.
not really, you're holding space for the next person, okay? And it's really important that, you don't go into a role like that because you can't do that, especially if you're internal. You can't even do that if you're like an external. I will, however, give myself credit. The one smart thing that I did do was that Joseph at the time wanted me to come in to be interim for a year, and I said, I don't think I can commit for a year, right? And I negotiated hard. I said, how's this? Let's try it out for 6 months. At the end of 6 months, let's check in, right? Let's see how things are going, right? And then let's talk about extending it 6 months, or, we just shake hands and we're good, right? And it gave us both a way formally within that agreement to check in and then also amicably walk away if things were not, going well. Which connects to the big, big recommendation that I have is that everything is negotiable, everything, right? And you want to go in with this mentality, and this is different from negotiating like a job offer, right? The negotiation in terms of an interim role is different, right? You you really, especially as an internal person, this is your opportunity to bring your expertise of the scope of work that you think needs to happen. So, Letitia, right, when you were thinking about that role, I'm sure you knew what needed to be prioritized, right? And you helped guide that priority making, right?
I did. I knew what
Yeah,
needed to be prioritized. Um,
yeah.
but I think though it's still a little tricky and it depends
Hmm.
on your context because you could know what needs to be prioritized, but the fact that you're still expected to sit and do both roles,
Hmm.
um, I think one of the things that I wrote down as you were speaking, Dawn, was kind of now making your list of what you can't do because it's
Yes.
actually physically impossible to do all of it. And
Yeah.
I think that is something. So yes, you set the priority list, but that also means there's some things that are going to have to drop off, even if
Yeah.
they were personally important to you. It's just not possible to do all of it.
Right. Yeah. And so for internal folks, this is the one thing, you can help guide that decision making and help, the senior leader understand this is what's possible within this amount of time and with what's going on in our context right now. I would recommend that maybe we put these things on the shelf, right? And the other piece is and this connects to what Ed said, is that, well, based on the fact that you're in this hiring process, this is why I think these things should be prioritized, right? So really helping guide that, and negotiating what's possible or what's not really sets yourself up for success in the role, right? And sets expectations. The other thing that's part of negotiation too is negotiating the compensation. Oh my gosh, there's so many, and Keith knows that, at the AVP conference, I was shocked to find that people were considering interim roles with very paltry additional pay, right? You're doing a whole nother, potentially a whole nother role with a whole bunch of lists of priorities, right? This is where, you go and do your homework, you talk about, right, what is fair and what is equitable. Please do not do anything for free. Okay, please, please, please. I know everyone's like, it's a great opportunity. This is a great way to get your experience and all that stuff. Please don't do anything for free, because what you will get out of it, right, is definitely not only, getting exposure to all of this stuff, but you're going to be doing all this extra work. So please, get compensation for that. And then the last thing I'll say in terms of recommendations is just make sure that you take time to identify what are the things you want out of this interim experience. It should align. I know it's so hard because it's so awesome to feel wanted. People want you, to step up and do this role, right? But think really clearly. And some of the, senior leadership coaching that I do, especially with AVPs and with emerging leaders that are directors, right? I'm like, well, how do you benefit from this? Right? What are the things that you want out of this? Yes, this gets you, more exposure. You get to add this on your resume, but be very, very intentional to make sure it aligns, because it's going to be much more high stakes because you have, very, very clear deliverables.
I think the thing I wanted to add, because Dawn, what you said in terms of being clear, I think sometimes, you're not like for me, I've reported to presidents before, but somebody else in an interim role, like say an AVP who's now becoming serving as an interim VP who has not been a chief student affairs officer before, understanding kind of the scope of the role. Like if you haven't been to a cabinet and or those kinds of things. And so for me, I think it's also important to then see this as how am I going to learn from folks who are actually in the substantive position? And so making sure that your network, and whether you want to call it mentorship or whatever you want to call it, that you are interacting. If the role is VPSA, you're interacting with VPSAs who you can have some kind of candid conversations with, because now you're probably also experiencing things that you hadn't, and you're going to kind of have to be kind of learning at a very quick pace. And I think one of the ways to do that, because quite frankly, presidents are busy. And one of the best ways to do that for me, I found, is to kind of really have those conversations with your VPSA network so that they are also giving you guidance, because this is just a new thing that you're doing and you haven't been exposed to a lot of it before.
Mhm. Yeah, and
So,
I'll just add one more thing before we go to the next thing, right? Just one really quick thing. So in my other two interim roles, I was interim chief diversity officer and interim associate vice president and dean of students. 100% what you said, Letitia. I had other folks within the organization to help me understand the scope of the role, but then also provide peer support and peer guidance. So it doesn't you can have mentors and then also have peer people who can support you as well. So
yeah.
100% agree with that.
Well, some great suggestions for folks who are considering. Now let's move to what if you're at the institution and you're thinking about an interim role, and should this be interim role? What should we open it up? How should we do it? How should we structure it, right? A lot of your feedback was make sure you have clear expectations, clear scope of work, you're negotiating these things. So on the institution or the organization side, or maybe a president or maybe a VP who's looking at an opening and thinking, I think intern might be the way to go here. What do you want them to think about? What would you want them to think about? Ed, let's start with you. What would you advise someone who's thinking about opening something to interim to be sure to be clear about?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think where I would start is to ensure that if an interim role is the right direction for the institution at the time of the decision, that you factor in the decision to do it either internally or externally, because both will provide a way forward, but differently. If you decide to go externally, how does that impact people on the inside who may have expected to be tapped? And what does that signal to them if they aren't selected as an interim?
Mhm.
I think that has some organizational, cultural pieces to consider as a president or a leader looking at filling that leadership gap for the time. Um, I would also want folks to think about how might you have staff voice in that decision to ensure that people have the opportunity to voice what do we need at this time, and then not just as a cabinet, you may have some understanding of what's happening in the area, but as someone leaves for whatever reason, you may need to lean on other folks' perspective to say, if we bring an interim for any period of time, here are the pros and cons and what are the trade-offs I think are going to be important.
Mhm.
The last thing I would offer is that if this is a position that you decide to hire either an external firm or use a network for, I think that's going to be important because it sets up the structure for the future in terms of what you end up doing. And I know there have been many folks who are in the middle of accreditation, in the middle of a new president who's come in, or there's something with the local community that's happening that they have to factor in. And so I think it's a multi-factor approach in deciding whether to stay internal for the interim role or go external. One size will not fit all, but I think those are some of the things I would ask that those people think about.
Mhm. Great. Dawn, what would you add?
Yeah, I think the only things I would add, and I've advised executive leaders on interim, whether or not interim roles are appropriate. So this is an interesting question because it's like it's from the other side now, right? I think if you're an executive leader and you're listening to this podcast, you're like, why should I have, right? So just a couple of high level things, right? Number one, it is a great way to create capacity at at whatever level to get that project or get that one thing done, especially if you can define it clearly and make it time bounded. It is a very, very cost efficient way to do that. Okay. Especially if you get the right interim person in to be able to do it, there's only upside, to all of this. It helps the institution continue moving towards a collective goal too. And so a lot of executive leaders decide to do interim roles because they're building an area or there's a leadership gap, right? So it is an opportunity to continue helping the organization moving forward, right? So there's really I think at that high level, those are probably like the biggest things. In terms of whether the appropriateness is is there, as Ed was saying, this connects to what I was saying earlier in terms of how I negotiate, right? Is that I often don't take an interim role unless there is a plan for a hire, right? And I always negotiate for me to be able to onboard and to stay on to be a coach for this new person hired because you can see this interim position as not only getting a new person in, but setting them up for success, setting the area up for success, and ultimately setting the institution up for success. So if you are considering an interim role for your organization, it's really good to think about it holistically, in that way, because how often do you hire a new VP and they're just expected to perform from day one and there's nobody there, to help onboard them. So it's worth it to commit those extra resources to have that overlap between the interim and the full-time hire. And then if it's an internal person, like Letitia, being very clear about how you're going to prioritize the things on Letitia's plate so that she can be successful in her interim role and also the other hats that she's wearing, right? So I think that that intentionality helps set everybody up for success.
I
Yeah,
love
I'll add
the
here before we get to Letitia that I think it's really important to distinguish if you're moving up into an interim role,
Mhm.
or are you doing the old job and doing the job above you in an interim role? So are you just now the interim VP, or are you the interim VP and the AVP, Dean of Students, or is someone else
Right.
taking on those responsibilities? I think sometimes that gets forgotten, and I've seen things where four people all move up, right? But the last person had to do their new job and the old job for a
Mhm.
long time, a lot more than 9 months. And so just being clear about that's a different task to move up into a new role versus move into a new role and maintain the old role at the same time. So to be clear about what is fair, I think Dawn said what is fair and what is equitable, right? I think that's really important
Yeah.
language.
I think just kind of underscoring from my perspective what I think um, an executive should consider the that interim structure that you just talked about Keith. I
Mhm.
think that's really critical. Like having a plan for that, in terms of helping whoever's moving up. Is everybody moving up? What is going to look like? And thinking realistically about the work.
Mhm.
I think that is one thing. I think the timeline, even from an internal perspective, kind of needs to be clear. Like this has not been my experience, but I have seen other people where you're interim and 2 years have gone and
Mhm.
kind of nothing's happened. And so I think really being clear from the beginning and then clear with the person who you're asking to step into the interim role about a kind of sense of the timeline and the expectations, right? Um, should this person apply for the position or should they not apply for the position from an internal perspective? Are we selecting you because you're the top person right now or the person with the most experience? But, we're not going to really, I think those things from the person who's asking or developing this interim role, they need to think about those things. I think the compensation as well needs to be clear, and I would encourage people to be fair. Because especially if you're asking someone realistically, it ends up being, I think even with any interim structure, you're going to be doing two roles, right? There's never enough of us. You're going to be doing two roles. And so I think thinking about the compensation, um, and then what Ed was outlining to me, Ed, I wrote down the word respect. Like, how do we do this in a respectful manner? How do we develop a respectful process? Respectful of the individual who's serving, respectful of their teams who are also going to have to pitch hit, respectful of the institution, respectful of the work that has been taking place so that those conversations that Dawn talked about in terms of kind of an ed about really kind of defining scope and expectations, I think those are all things. And then let's talk about clearly about what is not going to change, right? Because I think you get into an interim role, you're doing two jobs, but especially if you're going to the VP level, then you start seeing things about budget and hiring and maybe some HR issues. And you also want to be able to know, can I touch this? Should I not touch this? And you want to be kind of have some clarity about those things.
Mhm.
Keith, can I just add one more thing?
Well,
Because with
yes, but I would just say when Letitia mentioned HR issues, all the heads nodded in agreement and these knowing smiles came out. So I just that little context, but go ahead, Ed.
I would just offer one more piece because the HR thing definitely triggered
Yeah.
something for me. I would be asking questions either if you're thinking about taking a role or if you are posting and looking for someone that you clearly define whether your faculty is unionized.
Mm.
Because there have been things that I wasn't aware of, or that things that you may expect to be a certain way, but it's not in certain unionized environments. And so if you've never worked in a unionized faculty environment and you're going to one, there's a learning curve that you'd have to get up to speed very quickly on. Luckily, I've had that in my career, so I was comfortable sitting across with faculty representatives and all these different various types of unions, not just faculty unions, but other types of unions. But I think that there's just these nuances that as an interim is different than if you're just still if you've experienced it as an employee because you're now moving up versus coming in from the outside. So I just want to add that as something else to consider.
And I will underscore, please, if you're stepping into the
I think
role,
we got an amen there.
right, just read every manual there is. Read the administrative manual, read the folks who are in the union and read all the manuals, because especially at the VP level, you're gonna have HR issues. And even if it's not in the scope, as Dawn said, make sure it's defined. They're gonna come up because that's really what the work is at that level, and you don't want to be caught unawares.
Yeah.
That's right. And just to be clear, I love my union colleagues, love my faculty, love them all,
Same here.
love them. They make me better.
Yeah.
They are just so lovely, and I'm grateful for them.
Good, good.
Can I ask a question? Keith, do you have time for me to ask them a question?
Yeah, as long as it's quick.
Okay, okay. So Letitia mentioned something really wonderful that I don't want to get lost in the sauce, right? Which is that all of the teams are also going through an interim experience, right? So I just want you both to say a little bit more about how do we prepare, or what is that like, to think about from the team's perspective, because I think in connection with this last question about recommending to institutions, right? This is where we can also help institutions help set the interim person up for success. So Letitia, Ed, do you have anything there to share?
Sure. So for me, I'll speak very personally. There was we were actually developing a curriculum, which shameless plug, Keith started us off with that work. And so anybody who's looking to develop a student affairs curriculum should
Yes.
reach out to Keith, and he did not ask me to say that. But that had become so core to the work, um, that I felt it was really important to speak to the team about how we were going to move forward with that, and that was going to continue to be a priority and why. Um, and just kind of understanding that I was doing the speaking with the team. Like I knew that they were going through this, and I was communicating very openly with them. I'm not talking about, we're all kind of kumbayaing, but I'm going to say this is interim. And so it's probably going to feel like that to you. You have, vested interest in your work, in decisions, and so on. And so I'm going to be as transparent as possible. Also knowing that now I'm shifting into this role, and now I'm the senior leader, and there's not everything in the cabinet that I can say to the team. But being mindful of the communication, and from the executive, let's say the president's perspective, being understanding that this is a team process. And so that's why it's also important to be clear. What's the timeline going to be? Even when you introduce the interim to the community, kind of setting the expectation already. So there's a certain less ambiguity in terms of what that looks like.
I would just only offer a resource in this respect that Dawn has called out, and Lucicia, you've spoken brilliantly on. Managing Transitions by William Bridges is a wonderful book that provides a framework to help your team go through these types of transitions. It was so helpful for me in terms of a framework at both Montgomery and now at Frederick, that it reminded me of the importance of, as a leader, caring for the team in that way to ensure that they were doing okay through the process.
Beautiful. We'll give Dawn a co-host credit for asking the question there. Thanks, Dawn. We are running out of time, and this podcast is Student Affairs Now. We always like to end with, what are you thinking, troubling, or pondering now? So we'll hear from each of you what's on your mind. Might be related to this interim conversation or other things. And also, if folks want to connect with you, where might they be able to do that? So Dr. Williams, what are you troubling thinking or pondering now?
That's a big list, right?
I know.
I'm
What's at the
I'm
top?
really at the top right now, given the context that I think we find ourselves in higher education with all the things in the landscape. I'm really thinking about leadership development for persons coming next. I'm finding folks who are saying to me, I am going to continue to do good work where I am. I do not want to step up, and I am clocking it to retirement.
Mhm.
And I'm trying to think about how do we continue to form leaders, how we are transparent in the role, but also developmental so that we are shaping the next generation of leaders. I am finding that there are folks who've figured out that 55 is now a great age to retire from higher education. And I think we're going to have a great leadership deficit if we're not really, really much more intentional in providing people things like
Mhm.
coaching, evolve, all the things. I think we're going to have a significant gap, and I'm really concerned about that. That's one of the things I'm concerned about. Even as I'm thinking of my own position as an interim, and I've had to coach myself and get coaching. I think that we're going to have to really spend some time thinking about leadership development in higher education. So that's on my mind.
Yeah. Here, here. How about you, Ed?
What's on my brain right now? Well, what I'm pondering are two things. One is because of my background in researching technology, AI has been such a thing that I have been diving into with my team and with colleagues across the country. And adjacent to the AI integration and how it will change the way we work, the way we learn, the way we interact with each other is this idea of friction literacy. And what I mean
Mm.
by friction literacy is because of where we are with technology and how less when you look at folks the development of young folks today, and I have two young adult children, 18 and 20, and the notion of supervising multi-generational staff
Mhm.
where when friction hits there doesn't seem to be as much of that sitting in that space, feeling the discomfort, having hard conversations, and the friction literacy, I think, is creating space in a time where the liberal arts will most likely have a comeback because of AI, because of the use of AI in classrooms, more formally that we need to think about how student affairs plays a role in teaching folks how to go through friction, go through uncomfortable
Yes.
conversations.
Mm.
And I worry that if we don't do that, we're going to continue to see a sliding away from forget critical thinking, I mean, it's important, critical thinking, creative thinking. If I can't get you to sit in a room with me to have we can't even get to that stuff because
Yeah.
you're exiting stage right. And so that's what I'm thinking about.
Right.
Mm.
Dawn, you get the last word.
Yeah. Wow. I could not have connected with you both, uh, even, I mean, what I wrote down was like future right here. I was
Mhm.
ready to talk about future. And what's on my mind, I think, well, first of all, let me answer the last question first. So, I have a series coming out on interim leadership roles next week. And if you all are interested in that, LinkedIn is the best way to get connected with me. It's at Donley PhD on LinkedIn. And listeners, feel free to connect with me there. So that series will start next week, LinkedIn newsletter. Um, but the thing that I have been thinking a lot about, right, is actually there's a lot of really interesting writing that's futures thinking writing about not only the future of, higher education, but how do we create solutions differently? That a lot of the things that we've been doing in the past is it's still great strategies and tactics, but no longer, right, as effective, right? So Tracy Worley's work, also all the people returning to Octavia Butler, right? All of the future thinking work, I mean, is where my headspace is at right now. And this connects to what Letitia was talking about and thinking about what leadership development, the future of leadership development looks like. Especially, we are in an environment in higher education where this next admission cycle, we're going to feel that cliff really hard. I mean, really hard, okay? And with the number of consolidations that's happening, growing internationalization of higher ed institutions, right? I mean, this topic of leadership development is going to be huge. And this is why I think this conversation of interim roles is so crucial and important right now, because we're going to see the proliferation of interim roles even more so in higher education, with the number of people who are retiring because they don't want to deal with AI and things like that anymore, right? And then the number of disillusioned early career professionals, right, who are still feeling the impacts of COVID, but realizing that it's a very challenging job market. This huge reshuffle of all the leadership roles, I think we're going to see a greater increase in interim roles. So, folks who are listening, I don't count out interim roles. It could be a really critical part of your future.
Awesome. Well, thanks to all three of you. I've known all three of you for a while, and I really appreciate you coming and sharing, having this shared interim experience, but as folks have heard, really different versions of that perspective. So thanks to all of you for your leadership, your perspective, and your insights, and your willingness to share some of your experience so openly and so transparently. It's been super, super helpful. So thanks to all of you. I also want to thank our sponsor of today's episode, which is Evolve, which Dawn and I are involved in. Higher education, as you just heard, is facing unprecedented challenges and needs courageous leadership now more than ever, and poor leadership has never been more costly. At Evolve Institute, we are empowering a new generation of leaders with the capacity to turn these challenges into possibilities and lead with and through them. At Evolve, we help leaders develop the capacity to lead with clarity, confidence, courage, and compassion. We offer leadership coaching journeys for leadership teams and individual leaders focused on executive leaders, emerging executives, emerging leaders, and those leading for equity. As always, a huge shout out to our producer, Nat Ambrosi, who does all the behind the scenes work to make all of us look and sound good. We love the support of these important conversations from you, our community. You can help us reach even more folks by subscribing to the podcast on YouTube or to our weekly newsletter, where you get each new episode delivered to your inbox each morning. If you're so inclined, you can leave us a 5-star review. It really helps us reach even more folks with great conversations like today's. I'm Keith Edwards. Thanks to our fabulous guests today and to everyone who is watching and listening. Make it a great week. Thank you all.